In April 1987, what should have been an ordinary evening in Northwest Houston turned into a nightmare that shocked Texas. Inside a small apartment, police discovered a horrific scene. 23-year-old Adrian Newton, his 7-year-old son Alton, and 21-month-old daughter Farrah, all shot execution style. But the most stunning twist? The prime suspect was Adrian's own wife, Frances Elaine Newton. Prosecutors said she murdered her entire family for $100,000 in life insurance money, cold, calculated, and just weeks after taking out the policies. Frances insisted she was innocent. She claimed a drug dealer named Charlie was behind the killings, pointing to her estranged husband's alleged debts. Yet, despite no eyewitnesses and a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, she was convicted and sentenced to die. Over the next 17 years, Frances sat on death row fighting for her life. Human rights groups, legal experts, and even the governor of Texas called for her case to be re-examined. But in September 2005, Frances became the first black woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. What really happened that night in 1987? Was this a cold-blooded triple murder, or the biggest miscarriage of justice Texas has ever seen? Stay tuned, because by the end of this story you'll be the judge. Frances Elaine Newton was born on April 12, 1965, in Houston, Texas. From a young age, she was known as quiet, reserved, and deeply private. She grew up in a working-class environment, where stability was not always guaranteed, and those who knew her often described her as a girl who kept her thoughts to herself but carried a determination to build a better life. In her late teens, Frances met Adrian Newton, a young man with a warm personality and a free-spirited outlook on life. Their relationship developed quickly, and by the early 1980s they were together building a family of their own. Their first child, Alton, was born around 1980. He was energetic, curious, and loved being outdoors, a little boy with a bright smile who followed his father everywhere. 7 years later, Frances gave birth to a daughter, Farrah, a baby girl who was just beginning to take her first steps when tragedy would eventually strike. To the outside world, they looked like a hopeful young family. 2 parents in their 20s raising 2 children, and sharing an apartment in Northwest Houston. But inside their home, the situation was far more complicated. Frances and Adrian's marriage began to fracture under the weight of everyday struggles. By 1986, their relationship had grown so strained that, although they still lived under the same roof, they were each involved with other people. They functioned more like roommates than partners, maintaining the image of a family unit for the children's sake but privately living separate lives. Money was another source of tension. Adrian had difficulty keeping stable work, and whispers spread among friends that he was involved with drugs and owed money to dangerous people. Frances, meanwhile, tried to keep things together, balancing motherhood with the stress of financial insecurity. The couple's apartment, though modest, was filled with constant worry over bills, debts, and an uncertain future. And yet, even with these struggles, their children remained the center of their lives. Alton adored his baby sister and took on the role of protective older brother. Farrah, though only a toddler, brought joy and laughter into the home with her innocence and bright energy. They were a young family trying to survive against mounting odds, their story teetering between hope and hardship. It was the evening of April 7, 1987, a typical spring night in Northwest Houston. Neighbors recalled the day being quiet, uneventful, until police were called to the Newton family's apartment for what they thought might be a medical emergency. When officers arrived and forced entry into the small, dimly lit unit, they were met with a scene that would haunt them for years to come. Inside the living room, they discovered Adrian Newton, just 23 years old, slumped on the couch with a gunshot wound to his head. His 7-year-old son Alton was found nearby, lying motionless, and just a few feet away in a bedroom, 21-month-old Farrah was discovered shot as well. Each member of the young family had been killed with close-range execution-style gunshots, as though the killer had stood over them one by one. The air was still heavy with the smell of gunpowder when investigators stepped inside, a chilling reminder that the murders had happened only moments earlier. Detectives quickly noticed that there was no sign of forced entry. The door had not been broken, no windows shattered, suggesting that whoever had carried out this crime was either let in by the victims or already inside when it happened. In Adrian's hand, investigators found a cigarette still partially burned, as though he never saw the attack coming. The weapon used in the murders was soon identified as a small .25 caliber automatic pistol, a gun often described by investigators as a pocket pistol, small, concealable, and deadly at close range. Spent shell casings were scattered near the victims, confirming that each shot had been fired deliberately and methodically. As news of the killing spread through the neighborhood, fear gripped the community. How could an entire family, a young father and two innocent children, be executed in their own home without anyone hearing or seeing anything? Who would have the coldness to look into the faces of a toddler and a little boy and pull the trigger? This was no random act of violence. This was precise, personal, and deeply disturbing. And for investigators, one haunting question loomed. Was the killer someone the victims trusted? The investigation into the murders of Adrian, Alton, and Farrah Newton quickly became one of Houston's most closely watched homicide cases. Detectives were under enormous pressure to piece together what had happened on April 7, 1987, and bring the killer to justice. From the very beginning, investigators began to trace every movement Frances Newton made that night, and the deeper they dug, the more troubling the picture became. One of the key moments in the investigation was the discovery that earlier that evening, Frances had taken her young son Alton's blue knapsack out of her car and quietly placed it inside an abandoned house that belonged to relatives. This act was strange enough to raise suspicion, but it became even more alarming when investigators learned what that bag contained. After hiding the bag, Frances went next door to her cousin's house, spoke casually, and even invited her cousin to come over to the apartment on Westmount Houston. At the time, this visit seemed innocent, but when detectives eventually recovered that hidden knapsack, they found a .25 caliber Raven Arms automatic pistol inside. Ballistics experts quickly got to work, and their tests were damning. The pistol was conclusively identified as the murder weapon used to shoot Adrian, Alton, and Farrah in what police described as execution-style killings. The discovery of that gun would become one of the central pieces of evidence that prosecutors later used to argue Frances's guilt. The gun's trail led investigators to its original owner, who testified during trial that he had loaned the weapon to his cousin Jeffrey Freelow several months before the murders. Freelow, who had been romantically involved with Frances for about 1 to 2 months leading up to the killings, confirmed that he kept the weapon in the drawer of his master bedroom. Because Frances often came to his house and did household chores, including his laundry, she had free access to that drawer, and prosecutors argued this is how she obtained the murder weapon. Forensics painted an even darker picture. A state expert examined the skirt Frances had been wearing on the night of the murders and found nitrites, a chemical compound that forms from gunpowder residue, on the lower front portion of the skirt. The expert concluded that this pattern was consistent with someone who had fired a pistol while wearing that garment. And then came the financial angle that investigators argued provided a motive. Less than a month before the murders, Frances Newton had taken out 3 separate life insurance policies. One on herself, one on Adrian, and one on their daughter Farrah, with a combined worth of about $100,000. Frances was the primary beneficiary on all 3 policies, meaning that if anything happened to any of them, she would receive the payout. Following the killings, Frances did not hesitate to file claims on those policies, which prosecutors said showed that the murders were part of a premeditated plan. With the murder weapon tied to her, forensic evidence linking her clothing to gunfire, her access to the gun through her boyfriend, and the suspicious timing of the life insurance policies, investigators felt they had built a powerful case. Just weeks after the murders, Frances Newton was arrested and charged with 3 counts of capital murder. Her mugshot, calm, expressionless, and chillingly composed, was shown across Houston news outlets, and police held a press conference announcing to the public that they had their prime suspect in custody. This moment marked the beginning of a legal battle that would grip Texas for the next 17 years, sparking heated debates about justice, motive, and whether Frances Newton was a cold-blooded killer or a victim of circumstantial evidence. When Frances Newton's trial finally began in October 1988, Houston's courthouse was packed with reporters, family members, and curious onlookers eager to see how the shocking case of a young mother accused of slaughtering her entire family would play out. The air inside the courtroom was heavy with tension. This wasn't just a murder trial, it was a question of whether Frances Newton would live or die. The prosecution wasted no time setting the tone, painting a portrait of Frances as a cold, calculating woman driven by greed. They argued that the murders were premeditated and motivated by money, specifically the life insurance policies worth around $100,000 that Frances had taken out less than a month before the killings. Piece by piece, they laid out their case. The hidden .25 caliber Raven Arms pistol found in the abandoned house, the ballistic tests proving it was the murder weapon, Frances' access to the weapon through her boyfriend, and the damning forensic evidence of gunpowder residue on the skirt she wore that day. Prosecutors told the jury that Frances Newton executed her husband Adrian, her 7-year-old son Alton, and her 21-month-old daughter Farrah in cold blood, shooting each of them at point-blank range before calmly hiding the weapon and attempting to cash in on the insurance policies. But Francis Newton's defense team fought back fiercely. They reminded the jury that there was no eyewitness to the killings and no direct confession. Francis herself took the stand and insisted she was innocent. She claimed that a drug dealer named Charlie, to whom Adrian allegedly owed money, was responsible for the murders. Francis told jurors that she feared for her family's safety because of Adrian's drug use and had even bought life insurance policies in case something happened to him. She denied ever firing the weapon and said she only hid the gun out of fear when she discovered it in her car after the murders. This Charlie defense created moments of drama in the courtroom, with Francis breaking down in tears as she described her family's final moments. But prosecutors countered that Charlie was nothing more than a convenient scapegoat, pointing out that Francis never provided enough details to identify or locate this mysterious man. They argued that the physical evidence, especially the ballistics and gunpowder residue, pointed squarely at Francis and that her actions after the murders, including hiding the gun and filing insurance claims, revealed a guilty mind. After days of emotional testimony and tense cross-examinations, the case was finally handed over to the jury, who deliberated for several hours before returning with a unanimous verdict: guilty of capital murder on all counts. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read, and Francis Newton stood expressionless, staring straight ahead. During the sentencing phase, the same jury weighed whether she should spend the rest of her life behind bars or face the ultimate punishment. The prosecution urged the jury to impose death, calling the crime one of the most cold-blooded family executions in Harris County history. The defense begged for mercy, arguing that Francis was a first-time offender and that executing her would only add another tragedy to an already devastated family. In the end, the jury sided with the state, and Francis Newton was sentenced to die by lethal injection. The headline that ran across Houston newspapers the next day was chilling and unforgettable: Francis Newton sentenced to die. For many, this verdict represented justice for Adrian, Alton, and Farrah. But for others, it marked the beginning of a long, painful debate over whether the state of Texas had just condemned an innocent woman to death. What followed Francis Newton's death sentence was not a quick march to the execution chamber but a long and grueling 17-year battle on death row, filled with appeals, legal wrangling, and growing controversy. Francis spent nearly 2 decades inside the women's death row unit at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, years marked by endless court filings, interviews, and a fight for her life that would draw international attention. One of the most dramatic moments in her case came in December 2004, when just 2 hours before her scheduled execution, Texas Governor Rick Perry granted Francis a rare 120-day reprieve, not to exonerate her, but to give investigators and lawyers time to re-examine the forensic evidence. This last-minute decision shocked many, as Texas is known for rarely granting stays of execution, and it gave Francis and her supporters a brief but powerful glimmer of hope that her life might be spared. During this time, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the NAACP, and several faith-based groups threw their weight behind Francis Newton's case. They raised serious doubts about the reliability of the investigation and trial, pointing out that the Houston Police Department's crime lab, the same lab that handled Francis's ballistic and gunpowder tests, had been rocked by scandal and accused of flawed forensic work in multiple cases. They argued that crucial evidence might have been mishandled, casting a shadow over the conviction. Francis's attorneys also raised questions about the murder weapon itself, suggesting that the gun found in the abandoned house may have been tampered with or even planted, and that other potential suspects, including the mysterious drug dealer Francis had named Charlie, had never been properly investigated. They claimed Francis had been given ineffective legal representation at trial, arguing that her original defense team had failed to call key witnesses who could have supported her innocence and had not properly challenged the prosecution's timeline of events. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the movement to save Francis grew louder. On the days leading up to each of her scheduled executions, protesters gathered outside the Huntsville unit, the location of Texas's death chamber, holding handmade signs that read "Save Francis Newton" and "Don't kill an innocent woman." The crowd included activists, church leaders, students, and even people who didn't normally oppose the death penalty but felt uneasy about the doubts surrounding Francis's case. The sound of prayers, chants, and calls for mercy filled the air, adding to the pressure on state officials. Despite the renewed legal battle and the emotional public outcry, Francis Newton's appeals were eventually denied. Her case went before multiple state and federal courts, all of which upheld her conviction and death sentence. Even the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. For Francis, the reprieve had bought her a few extra months of life, but as the final execution date drew closer once again, she faced the grim reality that time was running out and that the state of Texas was determined to carry out her sentence. On the morning of September 14, 2005, Frances Newton awoke knowing it would be the last day of her life. After spending nearly 18 years on death row at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, she faced the sunrise with a calmness that surprised many who saw her. Guards described her as quiet and reflective, and she spent much of the morning in prayer and speaking with the prison chaplain, who later said she seemed spiritually prepared for what was to come. Her final visits with her family were bittersweet and emotional. Through the glass partition, she spoke softly with her mother, sister, and other relatives, urging them to stay strong and not to lose faith. Witnesses said she remained composed, even comforting her loved ones rather than breaking down herself. There were no angry outbursts, just quiet words and the heavy silence of people who knew their time together was almost gone. When offered the right to choose a special last meal, Frances declined and ate the same standard prison food that was served to everyone else that day, a decision many interpreted as either her way of showing acceptance of her fate or a refusal to give the system any spectacle in her final moments. Later that afternoon, Frances was transported under heavy guard from Gatesville to the Huntsville Unit, the location of Texas's execution chamber. As evening approached, the atmosphere outside the prison gates became charged with emotion. Supporters held candles and signs that read "Save Frances Newton" and "Don't kill an innocent woman," their chants and prayers filling the air. Reporters stood ready with cameras, broadcasting live updates, while last-minute appeals to the governor and courts failed one by one. Inside, the mood was quiet and procedural. Frances was led into the small, white-walled death chamber and strapped to the gurney by prison officials. Witnesses said she appeared calm but serious, scanning the room and locking eyes briefly with the witnesses behind the glass. Then she was given the chance to deliver her last words, the final statement that many death row inmates use to apologize, plead innocence, or leave a message for loved ones. Frances, however, declined to speak, leaving her silence as her final statement to the world. At 6:17 p.m. Central Time, the warden gave the signal, and the lethal injection process began. The clear solution flowed into Frances's veins as witnesses stood silently watching. Within moments, her chest rose and fell one last time, and she became completely still. 7 minutes later, at 6:24 p.m., she was officially pronounced dead. With her death, Frances Newton became the first black woman executed in Texas since 1858, and only the third woman to be executed in the state since the death penalty was reinstated in 1982. Outside the Huntsville Unit, the crowd of protesters fell silent. Some wept quietly, others prayed, and a few shouted in anger at what they believed was the execution of an innocent woman. Inside the prison, witnesses quietly exited, leaving behind a chamber that had just made history. What do you think about this case? Do you believe justice was truly served, or was Frances Newton an innocent woman who was wrongfully executed? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below so we can discuss it together. If this story gripped you, make sure to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss more stories just like this one. Your support helps us bring you more real, powerful, and thought-provoking cases every 2 days.